Throughout most of history, governments and those in power routinely punished blasphemers, malcontents, those with new ideas, and mostly those who sought to criticize them or expose their misdeeds. Even still today, all around the globe, individuals frequently encounter constraints on their speech, both in the virtual and physical realms. Even numerous European governments, despite their commitment to democratic values, impose limitations on citizens' expression. In stark contrast, the United States distinguishes itself by affording its people significant freedom of speech, a privilege entrenched in the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights. The constitutional framework acts as a formidable barrier, preventing the government from penalizing individuals and media outlets for their speech, no matter how controversial it may be. Central to the Bill of Rights is the First Amendment, which is arguably the cornerstone of America's media laws. Beyond merely protecting the right to express oneself, the First Amendment plays a pivotal role in shaping the entire landscape of media law within the United States. The Founding Fathers wrote the First Amendment in response to oppressive licensing laws and censorship imposed by the Church and King of England. Their argument is rooted in the belief that the free exchange of information is essential for personal liberty and the proper functioning of a democracy. This philosophy laid the groundwork for the principles embedded in the First Amendment. The First Amendment encompasses 5 fundamental rights, which are freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition. In essence, the First Amendment aspires to achieve several key objectives. One is an informed citizenry. Free speech acts as the vehicle through which truth can emerge and prevail. Another is a marketplace of ideas. A society free of censorship becomes a dynamic environment for new ideas, inventions, and innovative business practices. It also serves as a social good. Freedom fosters the complete development of individuals, enabling them to flourish as human beings. And finally, it can serve as a watchdog against government corruption. Unrestricted speech serves as a critical safeguard against abuses of power, empowering journalists and others to expose corruption and tyranny. This lecture delves into an exploration of these rights within the realm of media law. While the First Amendment broadly safeguards various forms of speech, including face-to-face conversations, movies, social media posts, blogs, photos, artwork, videos, podcasts, and more, it also emphasizes the freedom to receive, hear, and see such expressions from others. Additionally, individuals cannot be forced or compelled to utter specific statements. Crucially, the First Amendment extends its protection to all residents of the United States, irrespective of citizenship or age. However, certain caveats must be acknowledged. Firstly, the First Amendment's protection is confined to the United States, and those outside of the country may face severe governmental repercussions for their online speech. Conversely, Americans may also face punishment from foreign governments for their speech if it occurs outside the United States. Secondly, while the First Amendment shields individuals from government-imposed speech restrictions, private entities possess the freedom to establish their own speech policies, to censor expressions, and penalize employees, members, and customers for their speech. Private individuals can likewise choose to condemn, boycott, or disassociate from those whose speech they find disagreeable. Thirdly, the rights granted by the First Amendment, such as freedom of speech, are not absolute. The U.S. founders took a socially responsible approach, seeking to strike a balance between free expression and considerations of private rights and societal interests. Restrictions are imposed when necessary to safeguard privacy, national security, a person's reputation, or other rights and interests, reflecting a thoughtful equilibrium between individual freedoms and collective responsibilities in the media landscape. With that in mind, let's take a closer look at some specific types of controversial speech and whether they are permitted by the First Amendment. In general, political speech and religious speech receive the most protections and the fewest restrictions. The First Amendment protects a wide range of speech, even controversial and unpopular views. Attempts to regulate such speech face strict scrutiny by courts, requiring a compelling government interest unrelated to speech suppression and minimal interference with the First Amendment. Very few government regulations have passed this rigorous test for political speech. On the other hand, commercial speech, such as advertisements, is subject to much more regulation. Consequently, the government can prohibit advertisements that attempt to sell cigarettes or vapes to children, along with advertisements that make false promises. Very few forms of expression are outright censored, however, though some exceptions exist. Judges, for example, may restrict parties involved in a court case from speaking to the media to ensure a fair trial. The military may limit media coverage of its operations for national security reasons. And the government may prohibit its employees in sensitive positions like the CIA from publishing revealing tell-all books. Americans generally have the right to express their opinions in public spaces, though restrictions can be imposed on the time, place, and manner of speech. Permits may be required for parades and protests to manage logistics and fairness among diverse groups. For instance, a city cannot outright prohibit a hate group from hosting a rally in a public park, but it can limit the specific time and location of such an event. It's essential to emphasize that there is no First Amendment right to violence or criminal conduct. That's why the 2020 election protesters who breached the Capitol and protesters who blocked traffic to protest things like climate change can face criminal prosecutions. Additionally, privately owned properties can restrict speech, as the First Amendment applies solely to government actions. The First Amendment protects pornography involving consenting adults. However, any depiction involving children or minors is illegal, leading to potential imprisonment for those involved in its creation, distribution, or consumption. There have been instances also where high school students engaging in sexting with other minors face prosecution, as it can qualify as child pornography. Furthermore, the distribution of sexually explicit content without an individual's consent, known as revenge porn, is also illegal. Almost all states now have laws addressing this troubling online practice, recognizing it as a violation of a person's privacy. It's essential to note that the right to free speech, while protected, is not absolute and is carefully weighed against other constitutional rights, such as the right to privacy. Video games are likewise safeguarded by the First Amendment. Despite some attributing school shootings to violent video games, the U.S. Supreme Court has unequivocally ruled that banning violent video games or imposing age limits on them is unconstitutional. The reasoning behind this decision is rooted in the understanding that children encounter various forms of violence in literature, television shows, and online content, none of which are subject to the same restrictions imposed on video games. The court's perspective emphasizes a consistent approach to content regulation across different forms of media. Navigating free speech in schools can be intricate, with inconsistent court rulings on students' rights. Generally, college students enjoy much more extensive speech protection compared to elementary school and high school students. However, K-12 schools possess the authority to regulate on-campus and off-campus school-sponsored activities to safeguard the sensibilities of school children, to achieve educational goals, and to prevent disruptions. Instances of student vulgarity may incur punishment, for example, and schools can censor age-inappropriate material from school-sponsored publications. Authorities must establish rules to avoid school endorsement of a particular religion. Additionally, students can face consequences for their social media posts, a legally gray area where federal courts differ on the extent of public schools' authority to discipline students. Crucially, First Amendment protections exclusively apply to public schools. Private schools have much more latitude to restrict speech, although if they commit to freedom of speech in their materials, they could face a breach of contract lawsuit if speech restrictions contradict those promises. A related issue involves book bans in public schools, where an increasing number have restricted certain books. While school districts can control the curriculum and decide book access, the Supreme Court has ruled that banning a book should not occur for political reasons or disagreement with expressed views. The First Amendment's protection of hate speech is a surprising aspect for many people. Hate speech generally involves expressions that offend or insult specific groups based on attributes such as race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, or gender. In the United States, hate speech itself is generally shielded by the First Amendment, with the Supreme Court decisions consistently striking down laws attempting to restrict it. The First Amendment also protects other types of offensive speech, such as curse words, violent musical lyrics and movies, and flag burning. Regulating hate speech poses a challenge due to its subjective nature. For instance, on some college campuses, the term Trump, after Donald Trump's presidency, was considered hate speech. Similar controversies surrounded labels like Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, and even the phrase free speech. Recent debates also highlight the contention over whether criticizing Israel constitutes hate speech, showcasing the broad spectrum of ideas that can be labeled as hate speech. It's crucial to differentiate, though, hate speech from hate crimes, which involve criminal acts targeting individuals or groups based on race, gender, religion, or sexual preference. Legal consequences for hate crimes stem from the criminal act itself, not the expression of hateful ideas. While hate speech remains legal, making threats to harm someone is not protected. The First Amendment does not cover fighting words, which involve face-to-face confrontations with abusive language or threats intending to provoke immediate violent responses. Bomb threats or threats of physical harm are not protected. Harassment is another prohibited form of speech that is not shielded by the First Amendment, if it involves a repeated pattern of behavior considered offensive by a reasonable person. This includes situations where the victim has communicated to the harasser that their conduct is unwelcome and must cease. For instance, persistently telling someone they look attractive after being asked to stop would qualify as harassment, as does relentless phone calls with the intent to annoy, especially in cases involving ex-romantic partners. However, someone repeatedly wearing a t-shirt with a political statement you may find offensive, such as "Make America Great Again" or "F the police," would not qualify as harassment. The legality of cyberbullying hinges on circumstances. While expressing a mean opinion, such as calling someone fat or ugly in a single tweet, is protected by the First Amendment, a line is crossed when repeated messages threaten to harm or encourage self-harm. In such instances, the speech transitions from protected expression to illegal conduct. The authors of the Constitution and First Amendment probably didn't envision scenarios like cyberbullying. After all, the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, long before radio, TV, and the Internet. But that's not a problem. The Constitution of the United States is often referred to as a living document because its authors intended for it to be adapted by future generations. So amendments can be added to it, and courts can interpret how the First Amendment applies to new developments in technologies and issues. In other words, the First Amendment continues to evolve. It's crucial to recognize that asserting our First Amendment rights is often necessary. We cannot assume that others will automatically respect and uphold the rights to which we're entitled. Government and public school officials, whether intentionally or due to ignorance, frequently pose challenges to individuals' First Amendment rights, making it imperative for us to be vigilant in safeguarding and asserting these fundamental freedoms. In serious cases, you may even need to hire a lawyer. Organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, the Student Press Law Center, and the Electronic Frontier Foundation may provide free legal assistance. Lastly, be aware that while we have freedom of speech, it doesn't exempt us from its consequences. We have freedom of speech, but not freedom from consequences. Engaging in speech deemed improper may lead to various social repercussions, such as social shaming, customer boycotts, and even consequences like school suspension or job termination. The First Amendment shields against government restrictions, but it doesn't safeguard individuals from non-governmental consequences. Some people term these non-governmental sanctions as cancel culture, a debated topic in the United States with opinions split on its merits. While proponents of cancel culture argue that it fosters accountability, critics worry about excessive punishments, a lack of due process, and the chilling effect it can have on free speech. Cancel culture illustrates speech repercussions that, while not violating the First Amendment, may conflict with the fundamental principle of freedom of speech. The principle of free speech predates the U.S. Constitution, and it's a broad ideal endorsing the right to express thoughts without censorship or punishment. Unlike its legal counterpart, the principle transcends statutes and constitutions, embodying a societal belief in the value of individual expression. The First Amendment is a specific provision in the U.S. Constitution, and it only limits government intervention in speech matters. The confusion between the principle of free speech and the First Amendment often arises in discussions about censorship. It's crucial to recognize that no First Amendment violation occurs unless the restriction comes from the government. However, actions such as a social media platform censoring posts may be seen as conflicting with the broader concept of free speech. While the U.S. provides substantial freedom of speech, determining what's acceptable requires thoughtful consideration. Freedom to speak doesn't imply that everything should be said. Navigating these complexities demands a nuanced understanding of principles and values, and we must seek a balanced and ethical approach to free expression. Well, we've now covered some key aspects of the First Amendment and free speech, but there's much more to explore in my textbook chapter, so be sure to read that. Well, this has been Professor Grabowski, and thanks for watching.